We will have this discussion in English, and I'm very happy to welcome our experts here today. Firstly, I would like to introduce and welcome Nadine Günther, who is the head of the steering unit in the GIZ Global Project, Employment and Rural Areas with a focus on youth, which is being implemented in 4 African countries, Kenya, Mozambique, Malawi, and Burkina Faso, which we're going to focus on today. She has been working with the GIZ since 2010 in various positions and was also the co-spokesperson of the GIZ Sector Network Rural Development in Africa. Welcome, Nadine. Secondly, I would like to welcome online the Secretary General of the All Africa Students Union, Peter Kwasi Kojie. Hi, Peter. Good to see you. In his function, he represents African students on education policy issues in intergovernmental bodies and programs. And apart from his engagement for equal access to education, I know the Students' Union also organizes events on technical and vocational education. So welcome to you, Peter. Thanks for joining in online today from Accra, I believe. Then we have Samantha Ruppel, who is the director of the African German Leadership Academy at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. And her research also focuses on youth participation, peace and conflict resolution. And she has also been working extensively on Sierra Leone and Liberia, among others. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Bintu Zahara Sakor, who I think has the longest way from all the participants who is joining us today because she flew in from Boston. And I hope the jet lag is not too bad. So thank you very much for taking that journey upon you. She is a doctoral researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, but also visiting scholar at the Harvard University Center for African Studies, and her research focuses on youth bulges, insecurity, and unlocking the demographic dividend. So welcome to all our panelists. Before we get into the questions, I would like to recall the quote that former federal president Horst Köhler sent us, and I had prepared it in German, so I have to read it now that I have to say it in English. Because he said, among others, Africa's youth are to be reckoned with in the coming decades. Do we see the largest youth population in human history as a threat to our security, or do we recognize in them the potential that is inherent to young people? And this is exactly where I would like to start with you, Zahara. Because as the quote also mentions, that is basically the public perception. It's either a big opportunity, the large youth bulk, or it's a threat. And so this is exactly what you are also researching on. So first of all, I would like to ask you, can you confirm the assumption of a causal relation between missing opportunities and insecurity among the youth in West Africa? And what effect do you see from the surplus of young people on the economic situation and social stability in the region? And what role does the lack of jobs play in the current security situation in the region?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So thank you so much for this relevant discussions, and thank you for this very insightful questions. This is a very complex question that you gave me, so I will divide the question up in 2 parts. So the first part, I would like to first confirm that indeed my research focuses on this complex relationship between youth bulges, economic opportunity, and conflict, especially in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa and the West African and the Sahel region. And what we see in this context is that this assumption about this causal mechanism between youth bulges or large youth populations and conflict is actually confirmed. And in many of these contexts, what we see is that in cases where you have large youthful populations that are not harnessed effectively, it leads to not only social but also political unrest. And in many of these contexts, what we experience is that many of these youth are feeling very frustrated because they don't have meaningful work, right? So economic opportunities, so which lead to frustrations and grievances. But I also think that it is very important that we broaden this concept of opportunity and also think about political opportunities, meaning political inclusions, also social opportunities, meaning access to proper educations, access to health, for example, you know. So just to pose, if we have the combination of these structural or so-called structural factors, lack of this, you combine this with large youthful cohort sites, and in many of these African or West African countries we're talking about, you're also facing issues of poor governance, right? So you combine all these issues, you're most likely to have what we're experiencing in many of the cases in Niger, in Mali, and youth are not only recruited in terrorist organizations, but they're also supporting military coups, right? So what we see the commonality between most of these military coups is that they're not just youth-driven, but these youth are very technologically advanced. So they're very engaged in technology as well. So I think that it's very, very important to also notice the demographic characteristic of many of these countries. You have 70% of the population is youth, between the age of 15 to 24. And majority of these countries have also high fertility rate, which is going to continue. So we're going to continue to see this trend unless we take or do something about it. To come to the part with the surplus, I'm going to be quick on that. I think we need to, again, I need to re-emphasize the issues of this dividend. So if it's not harnessed, if the right investment is not made with this youth, including human capital, training, jobs, then it's going to lead to this boom, right? But if we do this rightful investment in this youth, we're most likely to see the case of economic boost, right? So increasing living standards means that they are more able to contribute to their own needs, but also to the general economic development. So just to add to that part is this idea that in many of this economy, they really cannot observe this large youth population. So this is the issue, right? In the economy, they don't have the capacity. The economy is very weak, and the private sector is even weaker, right? So then you see this in the context of rapid urbanizations. So many youths are coming to these cities, but there's no job for them. So that also creates further frustrations among them. And then also don't miss the gender dimension about this, right? Women are the most neglected in the labor market, but they're the most affected by conflict, right? So I think that we need to really think about the dynamic between these factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much for setting the stage in this regard. And Samantha, I would like to go on to your research. As you are an expert in civil conflict transformation and youth participation, you highlighted the importance also of what Zahara already mentioned with the inclusion of young people in peace processes and peace building. Also, you are drawing upon your experiences in your research stays in civil peace service projects in Kenya, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. So with regard to the latter two countries, what factors do you think play a decisive role in young people in West Africa choosing violence as a means? And where do you see there the lack of opportunities play in?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think young people choosing violence as their means is just one viewpoint of how to see young people. So I would like to talk about that point, but also about two other points that are very important and that we should not forget. So first of all, we have a lot of generalizing views about what youth are doing. And one is that we see young people using violence as their means to express themselves. The lack of perspectives often plays a role. We see that there are often no jobs, there's a lack of education, there's a lack of opportunities, there's a lack of basically anything related to what youth need in order to have a perspective for the future. So some young people might use violence as their means to show their demands, to show what they need. But we need to look behind why do they choose that means of maybe violence. And that could have different reasons. For example, young people growing up in what we would call violent societies don't know other means to express themselves than using violence. They know what they have learned. So they go with the patterns that they have seen in their society. So that could be one factor why young people choose maybe a more violent way to express their demands. We also see countries that have structural violence, bad governance, marginalization happening against young people, that also their young people tend to have more violent actions in their way they protest, they express themselves. And it's always the question, do we have a societal crisis that doesn't give young people an opportunity, that then have a negative influence on the young people to use violence, or is it the young people that have a negative influence on the society? And I believe it's more the first point than the second. We also see that young people not always choose violence because they wish to do so. Often they are instrumentalized, and that plays a very important role in what we have seen in past conflicts, but also what we witness today. Young people are often instrumentalized in a way that, for example, important local authorities, politicians, pay them some money in order to protest for some causes that then are turned into violent conflicts. Sometimes they're instrumentalized by these politicians, and we witness this in a lot of countries, that, for example, they're giving money to say, please protest for this cause. And then the same politician that is giving them the money is calling the police up on them. That then turns into a protest, a violent protest. So we need to look at youth in a more complex way. It's not that young people choose violence because they want to choose violence, but because it's manifold, because sometimes they don't have another chance, because they're instrumentalized, because they don't know any other way. So young people are also becoming not only perpetrators, but they're also becoming victims of this violence that is inflicted on them as well. Also, we need to see another viewpoint that young people are not always choosing violence. Of course, more people are choosing peaceful means to express their wishes. We have a lot of young people organized in civil society organizations, in university clubs, maybe in their own local communities that actively work towards a more peaceful society. And the interesting fact is they do this out of the same dreams, out of the same demands as other young people that might choose different means to express themselves. So the lack of opportunities plays a big role. The question is, what is my motivation to change something? And what means do I as a young person have to change something? What opportunities are given to me? Do I live in a country where I have the freedom to speak up? Or do I live in a country where I'm very, very oppressed and can't say what I wish to say? So I think it's very important to not look at the violence as a factor, but look at the lack of perspectives and look at opportunities for young people that they can express themselves, and at ways that young people can actually choose non-violent ways to change their future.
Thank you very much. And let's follow up on that with Peter. You, as the Secretary General of the All Africa Students Union, you are representing the young people we have so far been talking about. So first of all, I would like to ask you if you share the views that were so far expressed, and following up on what Samantha said about creating opportunities, what demands do young West Africans have towards their governments in regard to creating perspectives and employment opportunities?
Thank you very much, Sabine. So I think that I would want to start by thanking the German African Foundation for this opportunity to also share some ideas and perspectives at a forum such as the one we're having now. For the first part of your question, you ask if I agree that there is a link that has been shared by both Nadine and then Binta. And I think that, yes, clearly, I mean, these are conversations that we do have at our programs, at our events, and there's a clear linkage between youth employment and then security. Clearly, I mean, if you look currently, unemployment in sub-Saharan Africa stands somewhere around 12.8. This is as against a global average of 11.8. And you're asking yourself that what implications do these have? Of course, and even when there are jobs, the incomes that are earned are very low. These jobs are mainly in the informal sector, and there is no sense of dignity. And clearly, and that's what Binta has, for example, shared. And you'd see that even as there are jobs, these are not decent jobs at all. And it builds up with the frustration and everything. But we also do agree that as young people, whether we become a curse or we become a blessing is a matter of if we have the right skill set, if we have the right competences, and to what extent do we have education that is fit for purpose. And so yes, we have done this in several ways. We've gone on demonstrations. Sometimes we have protested on the street, and all of them implying that we have some demands that we're asking. These are things that as young people, we ask that our government will do for us. And it is in recognition of the fact that we do believe strongly that if our government does not invest in us in this way, most likely we will not end up being a blessing. And so what are some of the things that we imagine that our governments should do for us, for example? So the number one thing that around our tables we've advocated for strongly is that our government must make education that is fit for purpose. And we say that because there's a lot of documents that come out that show that the graduates that are coming out clearly don't have a fit into the job market. Even when you do, there isn't a market actually there that can accommodate all of them. And so, but the main thing is that the education that we receive today has to be fit for purpose, because the world of work has changed fundamentally to what it was. And so that is the number one ask that we ask for. And clearly, this will imply that the curriculum has to be relooked at. And then the number two thing that mainly comes around during our conversation, the mini desktop researches that we have done clearly shows that young people are asking that our government create a business environment that we imagine is one that is friendly and one that is supportive. And mainly because when we talk, we agree that it is not for the lack of ideas. The point is that we do have wonderful business ideas, but what clearly we lack is the capital to ensure that these initiatives are ones that we can actually translate them into tangibles. And then yesterday, when I followed some sections of the conversation, one thing kept coming up, and the speakers that spoke yesterday were asking that Germany, for example, should take an interest in AFTA. And as young people, we see a huge hope in AFTA. Why? Because we do understand that if a market is built that large, and we're able to circulate our skill sets and our competences, because issue of unemployment is a matter of demand and supply. And so if there is excess of demand in Ghana, for example, and there can be a space in, let's say, Togo, where we can circulate our skill sets, our competences over there, it means that AFTA can become an opportunity for us. So clearly, we also want that our government should ratify all the protocols that they have to do to make sure that ACTA becomes a reality. And just to also add that sometimes we miss the point in thinking that young people are the future and it's so far away. Just a couple of weeks back, I joined a conference and one man shared something. He told his elderly group of people that, look, these young people are the ones who would one day they'll pay our pension funds, they'll pay everything. And so if we don't treat them well, we don't invest in them, the day will come when they sit on our pensions, they make a decision on how we should live, and they won't make very good ones. So I think that I would end on this note, and then maybe we'll look at the other round of the questions.
Thank you so much, Peter, also for the very concrete demands that you put out. So from there, let's jump now to employment promotion from outside, which is from Germany. And Nadine, I would like to get you in here because creating jobs for young Africans is also at the heart of economic cooperation with Africa. And your project, your global project has been running since 2018 already. So with view to Burkina Faso, how exactly does employment promotion actually work on the ground? And what have you achieved so far with the project? And what are the biggest challenges?
Yeah, hello and thank you very much. Yes, we are a global project financed by the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ. And we are active in 4 countries, as you said, and we started being active in 2020. So the global project started before, and then we became active in 2020. And we are implementing an approach that is called an integrated approach for employment promotion. It has 3 main pillars. It's to promote the labor supply and the labor demand side, so the qualification and the private sector, and to bring that together to match it. But we have adapted it to rural areas and specifically to the agriculture and agri-food sector. And we have a specific focus on young people and especially young women. As we heard, they have like a triple burden. If you are young, female, and you live in a rural area, it's a specific challenge to come into employment. And we have to do things quite differently than, for example, in urban areas or other sectors. We look much more into skills and qualifications, as we heard. It's very important, and also more on startup and self-employment. As I think you mentioned it, the private sector in rural areas is quite weak. There are very little enterprises that offer formal jobs, so self-employment is one way to go. So we call this the 360-degree agri-jobs approach. So we look at the rural labor market really from all sides and bring it together. So what we do specifically in Burkina Faso to make it a bit more concrete. So first of all, of course, we don't work alone. We have a lot of partners from all kinds of backgrounds. So we work a lot with the civil society and NGOs, especially when we can't have access to certain rural areas because of the security situation. We work a lot with the private sector, with business associations, and of course with the government as far as possible. So in the first pillar, we work a lot on qualification and skills. We offer short-term vocational trainings for about 6,000 young people in new and profitable business models, so that are accessible for the youth. They don't need huge investments, they don't need a lot of land. So for example, in the poultry production, in the processing of mangoes, or in new services such as for mango orchard management. For us, it's important that we offer technical but also entrepreneurial skills when they leave these trainings. On the other side, we support the private sector. So we support about 2,500 small and medium enterprises, startups, and young farmers. So we do startup programs for young entrepreneurs in agriculture-based value chains, same for SMEs, to make them grow and to offer more jobs, and also some wage employment. And we, to a certain degree, cooperate with larger companies to help them to include young farmers into their supply chains and to offer them market access. And then we try to bring that together, the skilled youth and the new jobs. And we offer some internships, we do rural job fairs, some career advice. And as we also heard, political opportunities and participation is very important. We support, and in Burkina Faso, it's 3 young youth organizations in rural areas. The youth are very little organized, and we help them to get more representation of their interests in political decision making, but also to offer more services for their members to become active in the agribusiness sector. For us, it's important, and we do that in all countries. We work, whenever possible, very close with the private sector as a driver of employment. We have a strong business orientation. We are very much youth-centered, so we start from the opportunities, the potentials, and the interests of the youth. I already said we are very women-specific, so we try to offer very women-specific trainings and business opportunities. And we try to cooperate with public structures like public training centers whenever possible. Our goals for the global project that we have agreed on with the BMZ is to improve the training and employment situation for about 30,000 young people in these 4 countries. In Burkina, we are targeting 8,000 people. And so far, we have reached about 20,000 that agree that they have better employment opportunities now, and around 5,000 have already found a new job or increased their employment and also their income. On the challenges, for the target group, one of the big challenges is to find access to finance. Like for a young entrepreneur, his new startup, his new business, it's really difficult to get financing from the official financing institutions. So this could really boost their enterprise if that would be much easier. For the project, we needed to adapt a lot to a specific context. We started with Corona, then we had the impacts of the war against Ukraine, also in Africa with high fertilizer and input prices. And then for Burkina Faso, for example, in the last year, we had 2 coups d'etat, 2 state coups. Of course, all these fragile situation, the security situation in Burkina Faso is challenging for the target group, but also for the project. In terms of mobility, market access for us to certain areas for trainings, higher costs, and it's also difficult to monitor the effects if you can't implement by yourself. Yeah, I think that's it for now.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting to have this view on what actually happens, because as we all know, it's always in the papers that it's a big thing, employment promotion, but what it actually entails is hardly ever talked about here. But following up on what you just said and the challenges you pointed out, with especially also evaluating, I mean, to what extent do you think it can be said that this program really contributes to stability, to political stability in the country?
I can't judge this from a political or scientific view, as we don't monitor stabilizing effects for our project. But what we see from the field, some impressions, is that I fully agree that as far as we can observe it, legal and economically viable income and employment opportunities, especially in rural areas for young people, are one important part of stabilizing such a region. So why is that? Our offers are very well accepted. There's a great demand. We could offer much more training and much more incubation. There are so many young people who want to participate. So they show a great interest in legal and jobs and income opportunities. In my experience, especially for Burkinabe, the young ones, they're really entrepreneurial. They come with that spirit, that mindset. They want to develop something on their own. And what we can do from the outside as an international corporation is to help them to make better and faster progress and leverage their potentials. And it also has some indirect effect. It radiates to the environment. When we go to the south of Burkina Faso, we meet young women that have been supported in, for example, the food processing. So in very short time, they hire 3 to 4 other young people to help them in the different tasks they have to do. And there is a certain dynamic, like an atmosphere of departure, of moving on, and there are new job perspectives that are created. And in my view, this dynamic offers some opportunity for the stabilization of the region, because it modernizes the agricultural sector, it promotes productivity, income, new enterprises are created, and there is like a dynamic in the rural areas. And young people, they start to become role models, positive ones, because they are showing that there is an attractive opportunity and that they can be like change agents for the others. And such an economic development stabilizes, because such regions, otherwise they would be abandoned. People would go to, I think Peter said it, they go to cities where they don't really find a job because they don't have the skills. Only the elderly remain. We have a problem of hunger and poverty, of food insecurity, and it's easy for armed groups to establish themselves in such areas. We have like the same target group for our project than the terrorist groups for recruitment. It's the young people between 15 and 35, which is a huge group in Burkina Faso. And with this economic perspective, they remain in these areas. They have something to lose if they go. They have invested, they have a reputation, they have created their business. You don't give that up so lightly, and you want to have stable framework conditions to grow. So this can counterbalance armed groups to a certain degree, and because they are recruiting among this target group. And I think that this economic development is not, it doesn't help alone. But it is a good combination if you bring in other stabilization measures. For example, if you improve on the human security aspect, on local governance, on local services, and on participation. So all this together can, from my perspective, stabilize such regions and play an important aspect. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Definitely also sounds like some upscaling is needed for numbers. Zahara, I would like to dwell on this question, the connection of employment promotion and stability a little bit more and look at it from different angles. So from what you have just heard and also from your own research, how and how much can employment promotion from outside contribute to the stabilization? Which other political measures are needed? Nadine just also, of course, gave some. And yeah, how can the demographic dividend really be unlocked?
I think Nadine clearly emphasized the connection between job creations and these programs and the stabilization. So I don't think I need to dwell more on that, because it does indeed lead to stability in many of these regions. But I think this has to be seen in a wider policy framework context. So you can't just only focus on job creation and also neglect other parts of needs, so social need, political needs. So I think some of these measures that needs to be taken in order to achieve this demographic dividend. I will list 4 points that I think is very, very important that should be taken into consideration when policymakers both in the African continent, but also outside of the African continent, are making policy. But before that, I really want to emphasize that when we think about African youth, we need to change our narrative about them. If you keep saying to someone, you are worthless, they're going to eventually become, that. So I think the way we think about African youth, the way we speak about African youth needs to be changed in various, not only in the academic field, but also in various fields, I think. In terms of the policies, so first of all, reducing economic vulnerability is very important, right? So we need to create jobs, which we already established. But when we think about this, creating jobs not only lead to economic stability, but it also reduce this vulnerability of being recruited in terrorist groups. But this has to be connected to political and social cohesion. So people have to feel the need to, they have to feel belonging in a community, right? And they also have to feel like they can express their voice, political voices, without being, as you said, suppressed. Secondly, I think human capital, investment in African human capital is, I think, definitely one of the most important things, because you look at many of the education systems someone mentioned today is really outdated. These are
education system that was established in the colonial time. It does not serve African youth or the African economy today. So we need to really, really change this and not only build the education system and the knowledge, and also creating own African knowledge, right? That is led and produced by African to benefit African people as well. So this involves technological knowledge, this involves various forms of knowledge as well. Thirdly, I think that there's a need for promotion of inclusive economic growth. What do I mean by that? I think, first of all, we need to address this gender gap in the labor market. Women has to be included in the labor market in order to achieve the demographic dividend, right? Secondly, entrepreneurship is so, so important. You have many youth that have the ideas, but they don't know how to transform this idea into a economic project that can benefit not only them, but also the whole community, right? So many of the businesses that are creating in Africa are very day-to-day. So people create a business today, and within 2 or 3 days, the business fails, basically. And I think this has to be changed, so we need to bridge this gap between the informal and the formal sector, right? Majority of the youth are in the formal, majority of the women that contribute to this economy are in the informal sector, so this has to be bridged together. And I think this is where countries such as Germany that are really, that are doing really well in this area can come and contribute in this area. I think regional integration is very important because they foster job creations. This has already been mentioned. And I think also this international assistance by partners such as Germany and Norway and these countries is very important, but it's not in terms of financial assistance. We need to think about technical expertise and capacity building. You don't want to come and create a project in a place and then you leave and the project collapses. This is wrong. We need to change this mentality. And then lastly, I want to focus on the peace building and conflict resolution aspect. I think this, first of all, has to be led by Africans. You can't have other people come and lead your own peace processes. So I think we also have to think about how do we create lasting positive peace and not just short-term peace in these places. And then also, I think we need to think in a sense of hope. Many of these conversations, we talk about negativity, negative aspect of this thing, and it's a lot of fears, migration, youth, African migration, they're gonna come. We need to think in a positive tone, And we also need to think, how do we, each of us, contribute to this case? In my PhD, I'm developing a database that focuses on all African states' youth policy. And through this, I'm trying to analyze whether countries that have youth policy like Ghana, does this have an implication on stabilization aspects, for example, development and all these things? So I think the approach, in conclusion, has to be a holistic approach. And this is only the way we can achieve the demographic dividend, but also mitigating the conflict effect associated with African youth. And then lastly, the need of wanting to help Africa has to be genuine. You cannot want to help Africa just to exploit Africa because it's in a weaker position than you. It has to change. So whether that's Germany or any other countries, has to be very genuine about whether they want to approach. And African leaders, have to take more initiative and responsibility in this area and supported by civil society, which is unfortunately not the case at the moment. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zahara. And Samantha, I would like to dwell a bit more on the peace building and the sustainable conflict resolution that Zahara also just mentioned. For one, what would you say would make a successful employment promotion program in such a situation where we already have the conflict? And then also, I would like to go more into detail about the example you studied, Sierra Leone, because Sierra Leone is actually always quoted as a successful peace-building story, but without employment opportunities for the youth. So what other factors are crucial for successful stabilization of crisis situations, and what lessons can we maybe also learn from Sierra Leone for the rest of West Africa?
Yes, thank you. Maybe focusing on the first question about training programs, for example, for young people, how they can result into peace processes. I think it's important to see what sort of training is it? Is it a job training? Is it a skills training? And what sort of conflict do we have in a society? Because there are certain level of conflicts where other needs are needed to be matched before we can start with job creation and job training. But I think it plays an important role if we look at the long-term goals. I think something we see in a lot of countries that come out of a conflict, we have a lot of trainings, we have a lot of international organizations coming in, offering a workshop here, offering a workshop there, which creates people hopping from one workshop to the other, signing off, getting their per diems, creating, of course, an income for them, which is good, but it's a question, is this feasible in the long term? So this is something we often observe in post-conflict societies, and I think this is something that also the international community that is providing all these offers needs to be more coherent and needs to be more coordinated. And also at the same time, we need to look at what are the long-term goals. Yes, we have the trainings, which offer skills, but what are the long-term perspectives? How can these skills be transferred into the job markets? How can we make sure that the trainings actually not only suit the needs of the people that go and participate in the training, but that it also matches the needs of the economies that are there. Even if they're small, even like we've heard, there's not a lot of businesses in the rural areas, still there's something. And how we can match these training programs together with what is already there in the countries, I think that's very important. Looking at the case of Sierra Leone, like you have mentioned it's often used as the blueprint for a successful peace-building story with international support. Of course, that's always mentioned as well. Not looking at what has been done in the country and by local actors. I think that is often something that is missed when we see Sierra Leone as the success story. And I will especially focus on the youth now. I think what happened in Sierra Leone, that the young people there, directly after the Civil War and during the Civil Wars, they have been seen as one of the leaders in the wars. They have been seen as one of the major actors in the Civil Wars. And even when we look into scientific discourses, they have been the blueprint for what we call the crisis of the youth in civil wars. Looking at the conflict itself, not directly now after the conflict, but with a few years left, we see that this is not actually true. Yes, young people have been heavily involved in the civil wars in Sierra Leone, but not because they have chosen to do so. They have been instrumentalized by politicians, by leaders, and have been used, their anger has been used, because young people have been angry. They were angry before the Civil War that there are no opportunities, that there are no jobs, they don't see a future. And that anger has been used by people in power, making them look like they have created or played a very important role to start the Civil War. But that is not true, because they didn't even have the financial means to do so. So they were instrumentalized. And this is something that we see at the end of the Civil War, that they had a very strong stereotype. People were afraid of larger youth groups in cities especially. People were told not to go out if there are a lot of young people in the community. Young people were not given a voice anymore. And this is a narrative that young people in Sierra Leone successfully changed. They changed to a positive narrative. And there are certain key factors why this has happened. And I think one key factor is that young people knew the stereotype is not what they are and not what they have been. They have acknowledged, yes, some of us were involved in the civil wars and we have committed crimes, but not by choice, but because we had to do so to survive. Otherwise, we would have been victims as well. So there was an acknowledgement of that. Also, the Truth Reconciliation Commission and the report afterwards especially fostered intergenerational dialogue to bring different people from different generations together. I think that was also very successful in Sierra Leone, even though not all of the TRC report's commitments have been fulfilled, but especially the intergenerational dialogue has been very successful. Also, we see a lot of civil society organizations in Sierra Leone, internationals as well as local ones, and we see a heavy focus on the youth. And this focus has been chosen internationally in the first place because there was that stereotype, young people in Sierra Leone are dangerous, they committed war crimes. So international CSOs wanted to work to give a more peaceful idea to young people, starting these programs and then realizing, okay, there are other needs like skill development, job creation, and so on. Still, now we see that there is a high number of civil society organizations working with young people in Sierra Leone, but what we also see that this is creating a challenge for the young people. What we realize that often young people do work for civil society organizations, could be an international, could be also a local one, and they are not getting paid. They do it in their free time. Often they do it as a volunteer. And I'm not talking about maybe young people that are, let's say, 15, 16. I'm talking about people up to the age of 40 years. They are volunteering. They are living from per diems to per diems. And this is a very big challenge that yes, they want to be involved, they want to do the work, but it's not paid. And this is a very big challenge and an opportunity that is missed because people that are getting paid for their work are even more motivated. It creates more opportunities because young people working with the CSOs can also create new challenges. And if we look at Sierra Leone, this is where young people are very resilient. What we see, young people that are often associated with international NGOs, when they go back to their communities, they often get the feedback, oh, you work with internationals, you have money, please support me, please do this and that. And this is something that is not true, but this is what people assume. And I think their international organizations need to be careful to not create a new stereotype that is giving even more conflict potential for the young people in their own societies. So I think to maybe summarize what can be learned from Sierra Leone is that a changing narrative is needed for young people in their own countries. That can only happen if young people want to change the narrative by themselves, if they take actions to change the narratives, but of course they need support in doing so. They need to be heard. Leaders, community leaders, chiefs, politicians, they need to accept the voices of young people. Young people need to be paid for the work that they are doing to create job opportunities. This is not happening in Sierra Leone to that extent yet. Like you've mentioned, the unemployment rate is very high. And I think what we should not forget, Sierra Leone is often seen as a success story in peace building, yet there's still a lot of challenges remaining, and we should not forget that it's a relatively small country. So what might work in Sierra Leone might not work in other countries that are more diverse, that are bigger, that have other challenges as well.
Thank you so much for these deep insights, and I think we have now seen from two contributions the necessity of changing the youth narrative. And also, I think we have seen a lot about the question of decent jobs and getting decent payment for employment. Peter, I would like to get you in here again. Of course, first of all, feel free to comment on anything you've heard. But on top of that, since we were just talking about also the youth narrative and that they need to change it themselves, but also they might need support from other actors, what kind of support would you wish for from countries like Germany working together with West African countries in order to promote youth employment and peaceful societies?
All right, so I think that I'll start up from where Nadine ended. And I think that the issue in Sierra Leone is one that is more of a fragile piece. And so if you look at the just ended election, for example, I mean, almost by just the, I think I would say sheer luck, But otherwise, the country would have, gone back into where it was. And that's obviously because we haven't built the skill set of the young people. We haven't built the capacities of the young people. And so by some stroke of providence, we have retained peace. But it is not to say for certain that the structures there capacitate the young people to stay away from that. But also, I think that if you ask the question of what do we want from international actors, so for example, Germany, for instance, I would say that previously I got a sense that majority of the things that we will ask when, for example, somebody wanted like a job, we're asking where'd you come from, your tribe, how tall you are, how short you are. Those were all things that were relevant. But today, almost everywhere you go, everyone is asking you, what's your skill set, what's your competence? And so the conversations have shifted radically to put an imperative on what skills you have, what how relevant you would be to a workplace. And so the issue of skills exchanges, I do know that Germany has a very good apprenticeship program in place. And this is something that I really imagine that Africa would benefit hugely. I do know that it's been tested in some countries, but I would imagine that if Germany could, on a large scale, ensure that an apprenticeship program like this can be done, I think that would be very useful in enhancing skill sets and then competences. Again, I think that one area that would want to see international actors come on board is digital innovation hubs. It's clear that we're in a digital economy. Things like M-Pesa have really, shown that when we digitalize, there are a lot of opportunities there. And the good thing about when we digitalize is that we don't have to rent a big office. We don't need the sort of infrastructure that is needed for mainstream jobs. So I would imagine that if we wanted to support young people, one of the key things that we would want to do is to look at investments in the digital economy. And I'll also say that a lot more of the times, multilateralism also would play a huge role. So, for example, as young people, we've seen young Germans that have really come to show solidarity. So, for example, we started a campaign that we called Justice for Africa. And I would share that the Germans that we've worked with have been the ones who have been able to table a motion to the parliament in Germany. And the motion was to restrain German companies that use child laborers in their supply chain, wherever that would be, in Africa and anywhere else. The fact that the young people in Germany could take an issue like this to a German parliament, and the fact that a German parliament will begin to consider it and advance it to some stages is one that shows us that Germany could actually be a role model in a sense like this. And for a young person like me, it was really telling that Germany could actually believe that if something was done in Africa that was wrong, it is wrong everywhere else, and restrain their companies to ensure that don't use child labor in everywhere in your supply chain. But that is something that we imagine that if Germany could do that, it will incentivize our receptiveness in terms of their programs, their activities, and all that. But that's more of a moral imperative that we imagine that if international actors will do that, I'm sure that it will be able to change the dynamic of things. And then lastly, just to also say that one of the key things that we imagine could also do is that we wish that Africans are empowered in themselves. So I know that GIZ has a program that is called WeDo. And WeDo is a program that allows your remittances to go back to Africa, but not to be consumed, but to be invested in other areas that come with dividends. And so this is your own money from your relatives staying in Germany. But instead of sending you the money to consume, there's a program that allows you to make investments, and then the German government will to support that. And a lot of young Africans have benefited from a program like this that has lifted them from poverty, including their families. But this is like empowering us, even with their own remittances, and it's unique, and it's something that I imagine that if other international actors would learn, it would make things a lot more better. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter, for these very concrete suggestions. And before I open the floor for questions from the audience, Nadine, I would like to get back to you one last time. You already started a little bit on it, but maybe one more time. What are the lessons learned from your project, and what would you suggest for, or what would it need for further employment promotion programs in the future?
First of all, it's not, is it? Ah, yeah, it's working, okay. I would like to react first on Samantha. Because we also see in some of our countries this training hopping and then from one skills to the other one. And I fully agree that it's so important to have a clear pathway for them before you start the training. It needs to be very market oriented. Peter said the apprenticeship afterwards, the internship, so that you really give them a clear vision what to do with it. And in some of our countries, we also, before we start the training, we offer some entrepreneurial mindset inspiration, some personal initiative to really see that there is some motivation to start something and not just to come, sit, eat, go, and go to the next training. So I think that's important. And skills alone is not, it's not enough. So we need to really combine it with entrepreneurship. Only the two together can work. So I think that's a very important point you raised. One of the important findings from our project perspective is that we see that this approach that we are implementing, it works. It creates jobs and employment, and even in fragile states and countries like Burkina. And we see that the topic is important when we look at the number of the young population, and we also see it in the collaboration with the political partners that it is one of their main concerns. So to create offers for this young population. So from our sense, of course, it makes sense to scale it up, to disseminate these offers, the approach in the German, but also the International Development Cooperation, and to reach more young people. As I said, we have a lot of applications. We could do much more. Others could do much more. So there is a chance to really offer these legal employment and income opportunities. It happens punctually, but I think we really need some larger scale programs here. Germany has taken over the chair of the Sahel Alliance, and from a technical perspective, this is a great opportunity to work more closely with the European partners, International Development Cooperation, also IFAD and FAO and World Bank. They are following similar approaches than we do. And to really join hands, come together to have joint programs, bigger programs, or to flank each other and to really do an outroll of more of these activities. Some learnings for future designs, we see that, and this we already heard it yesterday, and you said it, I think the long-term cooperation, no, Mr. Zhu said it before, so we need longer planning horizons. Our project runs for 5 years. In fragile countries, you need time to create these networks, the local networks, to create these capacities with local partners that also stay after the project, to have access to regions where you can't go as a white person. So we need longer planning horizons. Then we need to think in a more integrated way. We need to integrate more topics like climate change and green jobs. We do that to a certain extent, but I think there is a lot of business opportunity, for example, in agroecological approaches. So organic compost production, biopesticide production can be seen as a business way for young people to produce it, to sell it, to make money. On the other hand, it helps small-scale farmers to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So there is a lot of potential. We should think that more together in the future. And then, I think what was already said yesterday, we have to think more regionally and across borders, especially when we think about stabilization. So security is not the aspect of one country, and insecurity doesn't stop at borders, and especially border regions are in the focus and threatened. So as a development cooperation, I think we should more look on cross-border trade, bringing these people, the target groups together, have joint activities, create these local networks and understanding of each other to also contribute to the stabilization in the future. And what would I personally like to see is I would like development cooperation to focus more strongly on the rural labor market and especially on young people in the future. So when we talk about TVET and training, don't offer it only in urban areas and the automotive sector, go to the agriculture sector. Entrepreneurship, there's a potential also in rural areas to do startup promotion with the youngsters and also private sector development. So the agriculture sector, it sometimes tends to not be so attractive, and there might be other sectors that are more appealing, but we see that agriculture can be sexy and attractive also for the young people and create the jobs. And the majority of the 25 million young people who enter the labor market in sub-Saharan Africa every year and who don't find enough jobs, as you said, the majority of them, they live in rural areas. They don't live in the city, they live in rural areas. So that's where we need to create jobs and opportunities. So to have a stronger focus on these areas. So I hope that in international development cooperation we can focus more on that and to have more programs like ours in the future, which then, I think everyone saw it yesterday in the news, they are all discussing now on the SDGs. Programs like these, they contribute to a lot of SDGs and are really making progress and impact in these countries.
Thank you so much. I think we took quite a number of very concrete recommendations that we can also carry into our conversations going forward with political decision makers. Now, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and then my colleague will go around. I can already see 3, 4. Yeah, Agnes, maybe you start over there, yeah. Thank you. We will collect a few questions, so please take notes in case you have to, and then we will wrap it up. And sorry, before you start, I have to excuse our president, Dr. Ait. She has to rush to the Foreign Office for one short meeting and then come back. So, all right. Now, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Frank Bertelmann, also from GIZ. And also thanks a lot for this panel and the topic. I really liked the discussion, also linking up yesterday to the implications for German Africa policy guidelines. What I always think is important, the complexity. We heard a lot about complexity, coherency of different approaches between donors, project, but also between different policies, ministries, etc. And I think this is a very difficult thing to do. And where's the starting point for breaking it down and working towards more coherence? I would like to have your opinions on the panel, but maybe also in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Volker Feigle, Protestant Church in Germany. I especially value this session because of the focusing of the youth, which is so important. Thank you for this. I have a question to Mr. Peter. Mr. Peter also mentioned in his comment the question of apprenticeship. And I would like to know a little bit more detail what you think about this apprenticeship. You praised the German system of apprenticeship, especially in the field of craft and other, like health service. Do you think of getting education then for young people here in Germany and going back, or having this apprenticeship program in the respective countries?
Thank you very much. Mr. Melchers.
Thank you. I also want to join Mr. Feigle on welcoming your focus-oriented panel. And I would also like to follow up to your question on the apprenticeship schemes. My question to Nadine Günther is, to what extent do you cooperate with existing institutions like vocational training centers? Because I think all over Africa you find these institutions. And then I would like to ask here our other friends here, when you say the educational system must be reformed, must become more relevant, to what extent is this field of vocational training centers or orienting the formal education system to more employment relevant education, to what extent is this already conceived and put in practice in some cases? Then an additional question, we had quite a few examples of national youth services in Africa, which I think, if I remember, all failed. The Tanzanian case failed, and we have an extreme case now in Eritrea, where you have a national service, which is very militaristic, which creates a lot of refugees, but it is a kind of a slavery system, but it keeps a lot of young people employed. That must be seen too, and a lot of projects, infrastructure projects, are carried out by this national service. So I would like to come back to my question. The failed and the misoriented national service examples or schemes, can one learn from them to develop national service schemes which are for the youth very relevant in order to get to proper employment and develop skills and get into employment after this national service schemes?
We got 2 more questions over there.
I'll stand up. I'm Maria Grosengarte. I'm an academic. And thank you to all of the panelists. And I think Nadine and Peter both outlined some key issues. My question is for Nadine. And my experience has been in Mali and Senegal over a period of decades. And I've been there this year also in both countries. My first question is, who identifies, defines, and limits the options for the projects that you fund? And then are they all collaborative? Are they all individual projects, or do you also fund collaborative projects where several youth can get together to build up something? And then thirdly, what about the transformation of products? Do you deal with that also? It came up in conjunction with industrialization yesterday, and I think it's extremely important. And with respect to Burkina, for example, one can talk about the transformation of shea. It's in so many cosmetic products nowadays, and so if it can be transformed, instead of just exporting shea butter, if it can be transformed into products, it will contribute a lot.
Thank you very much. And Helmut Asche.
Yeah, thanks. I will be a bit more radical. Yesterday we already had an elephant in the room. Elephants come in herds. And today we have another one, at least one elephant more in the room, that is state failure. I mean, we are talking West Africa, and one basic distinction that has not been respected in the discussion, at least not by the GIZ PR talk, is that number of the states of which we are talking, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and still adding, are not only fragile states. I mean, all these states are fragile to different extents. Democracy in Senegal next door is fragile as well, but is working so far. These states are simply disintegrating. 40–50% of the territory is no longer under government control. And so this intergovernmental program Nadine introduced, it can simply not work. It can do single activities on the Central Plateau and sometimes where in the south here and there, but as long, and that is my question, as long as the role of social actors is not completely redefined and not in favor of the regime, but in favor of local actors to achieve the new forms of social and political cohesion Bintu talked about, as long as that is not the case, these programs can simply not work. They will not have an effect at all. If Nadine Günther takes her baggage and leaves Ouagadougou, the program will collapse the next day. It is crystal clear. Perhaps we can instead learn something from the redefinition of social actors and role of the local actors in the youth in Sierra Leone instead of talking about such programs seemingly successful but not successful at all. And what I said, last word on that, Sabine, if you allow, this is not my individual view, it is the view of the Sahel Committee of the German African Research Association, of which I'm the speaker. So it is our combined scientific knowledge and knowledge from the localities for Ort, which I try to summarize here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Always good to steer the discussion. I can see so many more questions, but I would give unfortunately, I can only take one more. I will give it to Sara Bernardi, and then the rest we will have to discuss over lunch, because we also want to give the panelists enough time to comment on all this. But yeah.
Thank you to the panelists for this interesting discussion. My name is Sara Bernardi. I'm working at the Foreign Office in the head of division of the Southern Africa Department. My question addresses to Zahara, and which is a little bit less the focus of the discussion here, but you said that opportunities have to be thought broader, not only economic but also political, and maybe this links a little bit to the comment and question by Professor Usher. So how would you define these political opportunities? What would be the main, well, if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? And linking it to the discussion we had yesterday on the guidelines, if there's any advice you would like to give to the German government.
All right, and then I will give the word to Zahara to immediately start off on the last question, but of course also any other question you would like to comment upon.
Okay. Thank you all for the questions. I would like to start first with your questions. I think often when we talk about the demographic dividend, we really focus on this economic dividend, right? So the idea of this economic growth. But I think that you also have social dividend, right? And this also refers to, like, for example, trust. Right? So how do we build trust between not only intergenerational groups, but also among different states in African countries? So you also have political dividend, and governance dividend. So Professor mentioned something about state failure. So how do we ensure that these states are actually capable of doing their role, like fulfilling their role, like controlling the territory, providing the people the services that they need? So I think that the concept of a demographic dividend needs to be broadened, first of all. And in terms of this opportunity, I want to focus on specifically the case of political aspect here, political opportunities. So you have in many of the West African countries, especially the Sahelian regions, where there's a disconnect between the political elite and the population, right? So you want to implement policy that are going to help me, but you don't even know what I'm struggling with. So how can you help me? So I think it's about rethinking about how do we bridge this gap between the elite and also the youth. And this cannot only be done through democracy, like voting and stuff, because many of these countries are not even economically developed to achieve what we define as democracy, right? So I'm not saying that we should not, I'm I'm not saying that we should not promote democracy in these places, but what I'm saying is like we need to provide these states capacity that makes them feasible to achieve what we define as democracy, you know, and consolidate democracy. So I think that the youth can really contribute to this, and this can be done through policy development. And when we do this, youth has to be involved not only in the conception of this policy, but they have to be involved throughout the whole processes. So the implementation process is very important, but also the evaluation process as well. So this will make this policy more effective. I want to come to the questions, but we can talk more and more personally. I want to just briefly mention the part with education systems. I think, first of all, what you highlighted in terms of the vocational systems is it has a direct impact on job creations, and many research are indicating that, empirical research even. But when I talk about change in human capital or the education system, I want to give you an example. So you have cases like Senegal. They discover oil. But you don't have, a lot of the Senegalese youth don't have the knowledge to even contribute to the sector. So you have to import foreigners that comes in the country, which is fine, right? But they come, but this is a job taken away from this youth that are migrating, you know, that are dying on the sea. So you need to create some kind of system where the labor market, the need of the labor market, is matching with the current education system. If you have this gap, regardless of what kind of education system you have, it's not going to lead to any productive human capital. I think that would be it, but if I miss any part, yeah, I think that would be it.
Thank you so much, Sahara. Samantha, I will give the word to you, please.
Thank you. Let me start with a short one on the National Youth Services. I think we have national youth services in a lot of countries worldwide, and we see they're failing in some countries, like you have mentioned it, but we also have countries that use them relatively successful. Of course, it's always a question how we measure the successfulness, but if we look at Ghana, for example, the national service is in place there since a long time, and I know they started a study, I'm not sure where the study stands, of the long-term effects that the national service had on people and where they work today. Because you can choose relatively freely, I'm looking at people from Ghana here, where you want to work. So I think there are good examples that can be investigated, and I think we also need to look at the National Youth Service in Germany, because also here it's not a success story. It's also underpaid. The funding is getting cut this year, potentially. So I think there are a lot of things that also needs to be looked into the National Youth Service also in a country like Germany. And then looking at the other questions of how can it be more coherent, what is with state failure, I think in an ideal world, of course, and I think we are far from that, the work from international corporations could be more coherent if we leave state interests behind. Of course, we are far from that. But I think what we should not forget, international cooperation is working because they have their own interests, because the interests are there and they are not coherent because they are different interests. So we are far from that ideal world, but of course that would be the solution. And I think that also is the problem when we look at why are roles not changing, why do we have things that are implemented that are then stopped when international cooperation leaves. I think often we forget and underestimate the importance of the power imbalances that are there, that are inherent, but also sometimes not inherent, but very prominent. There are power imbalances. If international corporations in whatever form, education, financial support, educational support, any forms is there is a power imbalance. There is a state interest that Germany, in this case here today, is trying to implement in a certain country. Why do we have support for young people? Not because we love them so much, because we want to create opportunities there so that there is less migration, to simplify it, right? And this is something we really need to take into account. What role does this power imbalances play in the cooperation that we have? And can we really redefine the different actors that we have? Because if we don't redefine our own role and maybe take ourselves not so important in the international cooperation, there's no way to redefine the whole work of all the actors involved.
Thank you so much. Peter, I will give the word to you. There was a question directly directed at you, but also please feel free to answer any other.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for the question. I think the question that I saw that was directed more at me was regarding the apprenticeship program. And for what it's worth, I think that in the way that we've understood it, and I think, Nadine, maybe I can share a bit more insight into the national service in Ghana, because, I mean, I've undertaken the national service myself just a couple of years back, so I can't speak to something like that. Whereas it would be some level of a success, I think that hugely depends on what we're looking at. And so in the way that we think about it, I think it's more theoretical what we see at the workplaces where the postings are done. For example, people are sent to companies and they are not placed in a position where they can actually learn something. And so they are put in places where they just basically let them run errands to, let's say, take a paper here, do a photocopy here, those things. And those are the kind of feedback that we get from most of the students that go to do national service, at least in Ghana. What I can share to the sort of apprenticeship that we're looking at is, for example, I do know that Toyota has set up a very huge a hub in the University of Ghana. Now, it's supposed to intake a certain number of engineering people who will go there for apprenticeship. Now, these are like hands-on experience. You're not going to ask them to be doing photocopy here, photocopy there, or run this or run that. These are like hands-on experiences. And so that is the sort of thing that in our minds, we envisage that young people should be introduced to. So if we want to say that national service is doing well, it is to the extent that the young people come out of this with skills that they can use out there to either create a job or to get into like a job market where their skill sets can be useful. And so that's the sort of thing we have in mind. But I think that the question also, the question sought to ask, do we see this as just happening in the countries that we're talking about, or that it should interface between coming to, let's say Germany to also do some studies over there? I would say both ways. The extent is that not everybody would be willing or not everybody would be able to go out there. But the point is that if we're able to build the sort of infrastructure that we need to do this in Ghana or anywhere else, I think it would be very useful to the extent that they are able to practically learn the skills that they need. So that is how we see it. It's more of the outcomes, the more the fact that we want young people to be able to readily learn these skills. And if the existing national service schemes out there don't allow them to learn relevant skills and competences, then I'm not sure that it is really delivering on what we're asking it to do. But I think that the other thing that also I realized had been asked was the subject of the education being fit for the purpose. We have, at least generally, when we do our surveys, when we talk to young people across, there is the growing sense that the education that we receive is not one that is able to be used in a world of work. And so we push strongly for the need to build new curriculum that, of course, will be useful for us. And so we work with the ministries of education. But we also know that when we say that international actors can help in this sense, we do know that a lot more of the times when aid is given, it is tied to some extent to some conditions. And so if the conditions sought to imply that education has to be redesigned, it has to be reformed, then this becomes a more practical way for education to be changed. Whether or not that is is something that works. It's more of the power balances, like Nadine has said. And so clearly, I mean, to what extent if Germany wants to help in this way, are they shaping their conversations to say that education has to be fundamentally useful, such that it's not just for the sake of itself. So I think that is how we see it, and that's how we imagine that international actor like Germany would want to be able to support in a way like that. I think those are the questions that came that I can make an intervention on.
Thank you so much, Peter. And now I would like to give the final word to Nadine.
Okay, I noted some questions. Regarding the cooperation with the existing TVET institutions, that is a good question, and that is the basis. So if I look for Burkina Faso, they have a quite broad system of vocational training centers in rural areas, and we work with all of them in our project regions. And they also have private vocational training centers that we also include. So we don't work with other institutions than those that are present and already active. It's not the case in all of the countries that they have such strong governmental institutions. For example, in Malawi, there are very few. So there we work more with the private institutions or with faith-based training institutions from the church and so on. So we look a bit what is there and who's already active. Then what we do is that we provide them with capacities. We do a lot of training of trainers, and they are vital parts of developing the training modules that are based on business models that have been selected by the training institutions together with the private sector. And regarding the orientation to the employment perspectives, what we do differently is that we offer short-term training courses that run for a few weeks only. What they, in Burkina Faso, the public institutions so far, they run programs that go for about 2 years and that have little outreach in terms of numbers. So the governmental system in Burkina trains about 100 to 200 youth in the whole country that are leaving these institutions per year, which is very, very little amount. And it leads that in Burkina Faso, 0.1% of the local population, rural areas, have undergone a vocational training, which is nothing. So you're running a whole sector, you're trying to modernize a whole sector with a workforce that is unskilled. So what we're trying with these short courses to really get things running and to give them a clear perspective afterwards, to make sure they really come into employment, they can start their business, they have the starter kits, they have the apprenticeship, and we bring in our political partners, which is the Ministry of Agriculture and their Department for Vocational Training. They are part of what we are doing, part of the planning, and also part of the monitoring. So they see the impact of these short courses, and we try to convince them to also take that more into their offer, to not only offer these 2-year courses, which is kind for a rural elite who can afford to sit 2 years in a training course, and who is an all-rounder afterwards. So to show them that these short-term courses can be also an alternative for more youth, also low-skilled youth, but with a clear perspective and a clear impact later on. So that is on the training centers. Who identifies the options and the limits? Of course, it's not only individual startup promotion, so it really depends. Like, we do calls and people can register, so it's free. Sometimes we limit on the value chain, so we saw that this project or this program, incubation program, will focus now on the poultry value chain or on the mango value chain. But in some of the countries, we do that really open, so everyone who's in the agriculture sector can apply with their business idea or even with their SME that is already running that they want to improve. And we also take groups. So in Burkina, we supported startup youth groups that are working now in the compost production. They take the industrial mango waste from the industrial companies, turn it into organic compost and sell it. And they divide the different tasks in that business among each other. We also support women groups who often work together, and it works much better if they're in a group than in an individual case. So that is quite flexible and open. And we really go with the opportunities. So we have quite little limitations from our funding ministry. So we said we will work in the agriculture sector, agri-food, rural youth. And we had the freedom to really look from an economic perspective, what are viable business models that work for the youth, that are accessible, that are market-oriented, and that bring quick impact. For poultry, for example, you have cycles of 3 months. It gives very quick returns, and that is attractive for the youth. We don't do tree plantation that will grow in like 7 years for the first harvest. And we do a lot. I think there was one question on processing. Exactly, that is what we mainly focus with the SME and the startup promotion, to not go away from production, agricultural production. That's also a big potential for job creation, but to show that value chains can be developed. And there is a lot of potential for processing. You have growing urban and peri-urban markets that demand more processed vegetables or processed goods in general. So processing is a big opportunity and the main aspect of support for startup and SME development. I also try to bring in some innovation in terms of services. There are very little services for small-scale farmers or for SMEs. And so to show that agriculture is not just classical production, but you can also be in the agriculture sector outside of production. And you can do production much more attractive and innovative and viable than, for example, the parents are doing it. So that is a major opportunity that we're also supporting. Yeah. For shea butter, yeah, sure, it's an opportunity. There are already quite a lot of projects supporting this, so we choose to go in another direction. And then there was a question of state failure. And the redefinition of local actors. I think you can also answer on that, but I agree. So we need to really strengthen local structures, and this is one aspect. The local training institutions, the rural incubators that support entrepreneurs, and the youth organizations, that they come together, they create and build strong networks, functioning networks that are well connected to the local government, that can play a role in decision-making, that speak up openly for the interest of the youth, and to show that youth can play a very vital and positive role in the sector, in the rural areas. And I think that is quite important. I'm happy to discuss the project will collapse the day after we leave during a coffee break, because I don't agree. And it's also not about the project to remain. It's about the training offers to remain, to be sustainably anchored with the local training institutions. It's local NGOs that are continuing to offer services. And it's the startups and the SMEs and the private sector. They are ideally built on sustainable and viable business models, so they depend on the market and not on the project. So I think, I don't agree, but I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you to all of you on the panel for this very insightful and fruitful discussion. I think they deserve a round of applause. And indeed, I think it was very visible that there's still a lot of need to discuss further. Many people still have questions. So as I also mentioned before, we will have a lunch break now together, where you can also talk to the panelists. Let me just finish with another part of the quote from former Federal President Köhler, because I think it also sums up what we can take from here today, which is, despite all the current crises and conflicts, I remain confident and believe that Africa can become a continent of growth, employment, and life prospects. Europe would do well to stop looking at its neighboring continent with a routine air of concern, but to support Africa's development with enthusiasm and commitment and help make the dreams of the youth come true. And I think even though we have heard, of course, of a lot of challenges, we also had very concrete suggestions for their solution. And yeah, as you can see, also our patron believes in changing the narrative on the African youth, and I think that's definitely something I also take away from this discussion today. So thank you all very much for being here, for joining us, for your questions as well, and let's continue the talk over lunch. Thank you.